Let us start a new topic called World Trade Organization that deals with issues relating to international trade. And before we do that, let's look at the history as to how this organization came into existence. The first half of the last century saw two world wars, and after World War I, different countries sat down together and they wanted peace to prevail in the world, and they established what is called the League of Nations in 1920, and the purpose of this was to help establish peace around the world. And as time progressed, the issues that we faced were not conducive to peace, and that is, the victor countries forced the defeated countries like Germany to pay for all the damages they had done to different countries. And when you ask the defeated country to pay for all the damages, it puts a lot of burden on the people living in that country. And so this led to the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, and ultimately what we saw in the previous century is World War II. And when the World War II was taking place, people had gotten sick of the war, and the leaders had decided they must establish a new organization called United Nations. And the main purpose of this was to have peace and prosperity around the world. So United Nations was established, and they realized it's better to talk rather than to fight. And so United Nations was established in 1945. And based on the experience people had in the interwar period, that is between World War I and World War II, what they realized is we should not force the defeated countries to pay for all the damages that have been done because of the war. And so what they did is they wanted to look at the econ side and establish a structure so that peace and prosperity prevails around the world. And for this part, what we had is called the Bretton Woods Conference. This was held in New York in the US, a place called Bretton Woods. And the discussions here led to the creation of three institutions. The first one was originally called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And as the name suggested, the main purpose of this was reconstruction in Europe and development. So a lot of money was given to Germany to reconstruct and develop. And around this time, you must also remember that we had, before World War II, we had a number of colonies, and these colonies became independent nations after World War II, and these were extremely poor countries. So the role of International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, whose main focus earlier was reconstruction of Europe, shifted its focus to these newly independent countries called developing countries. And so what the World Bank does now is give soft loans or loans for longer time period at a lower rate of interest to these developing countries. Another institution that was created is called IMF, or International Monetary Fund, and this dealt with international financial transactions, mainly dealing with issues relating to exchange rate and balance of payment. The third organization that they wanted to establish is called the International Trade Organization, that dealt with issues relating to international trade. Since the focus of this course is international trade, let us look at the reasons as to why these people at the Bretton Woods Conference recommended International Trade Organization for dealing with issues relating to international trade. Now look at the history before World War II. In 1929, the US faced the Great Depression, and 1 in 4 workers were laid off, and the income of the US fell very significantly. Now, whenever a country gets into an economic problem, the first thing they blame are imports, and hence in 1930 an act was passed by the US Congress called the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930, and because of this the US increased tariffs on imports to about 59%. And what the US was telling rest of the world in essence is, look, we are in trouble, so we are not going to buy your product, but you do buy our product. And you know what happens when you do something like this? The other countries will retaliate as well, and that's what they did. And as a result, the world trade fell by 67% in 1932 as compared to 1929. So Smoot-Hawley Act of the US in 1930, this is considered to be one of the worst acts relating to foreign trade, because if world trade collapses, the incomes around the world fall as well, and this in a way transmits the problem that the US had on rest of the world. So this became a major reason as to why we should have an organization which deals with international trade. So very soon US realized its mistake, and it signed what is called the Trade Agreement Act of 1934. And one of the significant changes that took place is the US gave powers to the US president to sign trade deals with other countries, and this is when principle of MFN, or most favored nation, was applied to all normal trading partners. So this is the background in which people wanted an organization that dealt with issues relating to world trade. Now, Bretton Woods Conference recommended formation of International Trade Organization, but the US Congress refused to accept it, and when US refuses to accept an organization, that is not going to exist for issues dealing with international trade. So in 1948, they came up with a weaker version of an international trade organization called GATT, and GATT stands for General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the purpose here was pretty limited, and that was to reduce trade barriers only in manufacturers. So from 1948 to about middle of 1990s, GATT was in existence, and it did succeed in reducing the trade barriers in manufacturers. But when we are dealing with foreign trade, there are other sectors involved as well, like agriculture and services. So in 1995, different countries around the world decided to establish what is called the World Trade Organization, and the purpose of this had enlarged, and that is to reduce barriers to trade in all sectors like agriculture, manufacture and services. So what is GATT? GATT is a binding contract between different governments, and the objective of GATT was to provide a secure and predictable international trade environment for business community, and the main purpose of all this is to have a continuing process of trade liberalization in which investment, job creation and trade can thrive. So this is how GATT, this was the main purpose of GATT. Member countries of GATT are called contracting parties, and GATT operates in 3 ways. Number 1, it is a set of multilaterally agreed rules governing trade. When we use the term multilaterally, that means all member nations together decide upon the rules governing trade. This has to be distinguished from what is called a unilateral decision. A unilateral decision is made by just one country. For example, when US enacted the Smoot-Hawley Act. That's considered a unilateral action. And multilateral is when all member nations come together and agree upon rules governing world trade. Number 2, GATT also became a forum for trade negotiations, so different member nations could come together and they would discuss issues and try to come up with rules that are accepted to all of them. And the third thing, you are always going to have disputes in any forum you have, and when it related to matter of international trade, GATT also became an international court for trade disputes between governments. So this is how GATT operates. Now let us look at principles of GATT, and the same principles are now being used by World Trade Organization or WTO. The first principle of GATT or WTO is trade without discrimination, and this has two components. One is most favored nation clause. That means whatever trade relations you have with one country will apply to all other members of WTO or GATT. The second component of trade without discrimination is national treatment, and by this we mean once the goods have entered a market, they should be treated no less favorably than domestically produced goods. So once foreign goods have entered your country, people should not distinguish between what is a domestically produced good or what is a foreign good. There should be nothing against foreign goods once they have entered your country. The second thing is reciprocity. That means if you give a set of concessions to other countries, the other countries should also give the same concessions to you. Reciprocity. That's how you can have normal or equal trading relations. The third principle of GATT is protection through tariffs, and we know there are tariff barriers and then there are non-tariff barriers, and non-tariff barriers are pretty bad. They have more distorting effects, whereas tariffs are more transparent and have minimum distorting effects. So whatever non-tariff barriers we have, ultimately it was decided we must convert them to tariff barriers, and because they are transparent and they have minimum distorting effect. Number 4 is we must have a stable basis for trade. That is, the maximum amount of tariff a country can put on any item should be known publicly, because if each country starts making ad hoc decisions, one day the rate of tariff is 5%, that's the tax on imports, and all of a sudden it's increased to 1000%, and that will create a lot of problems for people participating in foreign trade. So what they have agreed, different member nations have agreed, is we must have tariff bindings. By this we mean that each member nation has to declare the maximum tariff that can be levied by any member nation on any product. That's what we mean by tariff binding. So let me end this lecture and we'll continue with principles of GATT in the next video. Thank you for your time.